Tallulah Bankhead's life unfurled like a decadent jazz-age dream, steeped in the smoky allure of forbidden indulgences and the shimmering glow of stage lights. Born into the fading grandeur of Southern aristocracy, Tallulah's entrance into the world was marked by tragedy. Her mother succumbed to chronic peritonitis just months after her birth, leaving a void filled by her father, whose grief swirled in the melancholic haze of alcohol. Yet, from this shadowed beginning, Tallulah emerged with an incandescent spirit that dazzled and defied. Her childhood was a restless odyssey through convent schools, her wild heart unchained by the austere walls that sought to contain it. The enchantment of vaudeville sparked her destiny, igniting a relentless pursuit of applause that would carry her from the sultry air of Alabama to the glittering theaters of New York and London. Her life was a symphony of scandalous escapades and passionate affairs, a testament to her refusal to conform. Tallulah's unapologetic embrace of excess and her magnetic allure became the stuff of legend, encapsulated in her own words. "If I had to live my life over, I'd make all the same mistakes, only sooner." Join us this week as we look at the life of Tallulah Bankhead. Born on January 31st, 1902, into the twilight grandeur of Southern aristocracy, she was the second daughter of Will and Adelaide. Her older sister Eugenia arrived a year earlier, but the joy of her birth was quickly shadowed by sorrow as her mother succumbed to chronic peritonitis mere months later. Ada's final words, "Look after Eugenia, Tallulah will look after herself," seemed prophetic as Tallulah, haunted by a vague association between her birth and her mother's death, grew into a resilient, rebellious spirit. Her father, a member of the Alabama state legislature, baptized her beside her mother's coffin, a poignant act reflecting his oscillation between high-spirited exuberance and alcohol-fueled melancholia. One of Tallulah's earliest memories was of her father, gun in hand, vowing to join his beloved wife in the afterlife. Despite his deep love for Ada, Will spiraled into despair. Unable to care for his daughters, he shuffled them between grandparents, aunts, and uncles. At her aunt's home, Tallulah found camaraderie with Zelda Sayre, both girls tomboys who reveled in competitive mischief. However, Tallulah harbored a deep self-loathing, feeling overshadowed by her sister Eugenia's beauty and charm. Her father's preferential treatment and his expressed wish for a son compounded her insecurities. Determined to earn his affection, she became a daredevil tomboy, jumping off roofs, performing cartwheels, and fearlessly confronting anyone who crossed her. At 5, her father took her to a vaudeville show. Enchanted by the performance, she began mimicking the star's sultry voice and innuendo-laden lines. One night, after a night out drinking, he placed her on the table and she performed the act in front of his friends as they hooted and cheered, delighting her father and his friends. The applause from that impromptu performance ignited a lifelong craving for the spotlight. As she later wrote in her memoir, "The cheering of a crowd did things to my spine, to my mind. I've often tingled to applause, but never did I have such tingles as that night." At 10, her father sent the girls away to convent school in New York. Restless, homesick, unable to focus on her lessons, and overwhelmed by the new regime of rules, she was continually being punished. Most of the other girls in her class were from the North and were quick to judge her as a Southern outsider. When she tried to make the girls at school laugh by telling stories or parading naked around the dormitory, they curled their lips in disdain. When she tried to join their games, they regarded her simply as an annoyance. Inevitably, the more of a pariah she felt, the worse her behavior became. At the end of term service, the pupils with the highest marks for conduct were given white veils to wear as they filed into chapel, and a white lily to hold. Tallulah, however, was singled out to walk in line with a black veil. Weeping, she felt like an untouchable. She said years later, after the convent, she was sent to a succession of different schools, being expelled over and over for smoking and drinking, to climbing out of dorm windows to meet boys, to throwing an ink well at a mother superior. With the onset of puberty, she had grown even plumper, and her skin had broken out in sullen blooms of acne. In her free time, she would pore over her collection of stage and movie magazines, and with pin-up photos of her favorite stars, the haughty beauty Alla Nazimova and the adorably ringleted Mary Pickford. She was convinced she could become an actress, too, if only she were pretty like Eugenia, or like her old friend Zelda Sayre. When she was 15, her father decided to remarry a woman 20 years younger than him. At first, Tallulah was against the union and viciously mocked her new stepmother, imitating her voice and behavior. But her stepmother had a good heart and took the young girl under her wing, suggesting she grow her hair long, helping her with what foods to eat and exercise. Within a few months, she had shed 20 pounds, and the acne on her face disappeared. To the astonishment of the family and Tallulah herself, she had become beautiful. In one of her magazines, she saw her chance to become an actress. The magazine was running a beauty contest for which readers were invited to send in photographs. The prize was a role in a film to be shot in New York. She posed for her photograph in a borrowed hat and fox stole, and such was her excitement that she sent it off without remembering to write her name and address on the back. 3 months later, she was sitting with Eugenia in the local drugstore, leafing through the magazine, when there, among the gallery of 12 winning photographs, was her own picture. Above it was the dramatic headline, "Who is she?" and beneath it an urgent request that the mysterious beauty make herself known. I dashed out of the drugstore, magazine in hand, screaming, "I've won it! I've won it! I'm going on the stage." Her father's objections were mostly financial. After all, who would look after her in New York? But after sulking and threatening a hunger strike, her grandfather intervened and offered to subsidize her expenses, and her Aunt Louise agreed to be her chaperone. Louise's marriage had recently broken down, and she had lost her youngest son to typhoid. She was in a state of abject depression and in no position to look after such a spirited girl. Her father advised her to watch out for booze and boys, and with that, Tallulah was off. Her arrival in New York was met with disappointment. The production had been shut down. But soon, she found a small part in a romantic comedy, Who Loved Him Best. For her part, barely more than an extra, she tore up the $25 check, saying it was too delightful to be paid for. Her aunt, believing they would save money, moved them into the Algonquin Hotel, entirely unaware that the hotel's restaurant was frequented by the Broadway crowd. There she saw Anne Andrews, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and the Barrymore siblings, John, Ethel, and Lionel, Robert Benchley, Haywood Brown, and Dorothy Parker. It was like walking through the pages of the magazines she had read back in Alabama. The first time she found herself in an elevator alone with Ethel Barrymore, she had to lean against the wall for support, feeling herself in the presence of a goddess. Her imperious manner, the scorn in her voice, the contempt of her eyes, the great reputation in which she was cloaked, made a violent impact on me, she said. When there was an after-show party or dinner being held in the restaurant, she flirted or clowned her way into the middle of it. I would have jumped off a cliff to gain the praise of the quality folk I met at midnight parties, Tallulah recalled. Within a few weeks, Tallulah had become a kind of pet among the Algonquin regulars. The actress Anne Andrews had never met anyone with her vitality. It seemed her feet could hardly stay on the ground. She was, however, too much for Louise. She didn't like that her young niece was sneaking out of her room, or the company she was keeping, or that she had picked up the habit of smoking. Louise threw up her hands and left, sailing off to Italy and joining the Red Cross to help with the war effort. Louise was replaced by 2 other aunts, neither of whom could control her. And in the end, the Bankheads decided they would simply have to trust the 17-year-old in New York on her own. Her father asked the hotel manager to look after her, to which he replied, "I can either run a hotel or I can look after her. I can't do both." Despite her age, people said she looked absurdly forwardly sexual. As the actress Jane Cowell observed, her face is like an evil flower. She's so intense she vibrates. She's one of the most violently beautiful women I've ever seen. Tallulah was delighted by the novelty of her beauty and by the permission it gave her to flirt. But she still hadn't engaged in sex. More than once, she admitted, "I trembled on the brink of compliance." As Tallulah would frequently and famously quip, "My father warned me about men and booze, but he never mentioned a word about women and cocaine." Tallulah was soon trying both. Cocaine was commonly used at the time, as alcohol was illegal and cocaine was regarded as a useful stimulant and unregulated. She spoke of the euphoric high she would get with the drug and how it helped give her energy for auditions. Her first real affair was with a young European actress, Eva Le Gallienne. The affair only lasted a few months, and many of her first affairs were with women older than herself. However, she was still unsure about men, and when John Barrymore offered to give her a role in his new film, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, if she agreed to have sex with him, she refused. Through friends at the hotel, she was soon given the role of understudy in a major play, and when the main actress was out, she performed well. She was then offered a second play, Footloose, in which she earned recognition from the New York Times for her considerable power and real skill. And in early 1921, she got her first lead in the play Nice People. Tallulah's character Haley was a new kind of heroine, with short skirts, a cigarette habit, and a smart, independent attitude. Everything the flapper was to become. The deep, throaty catch in her voice was perfectly modulated to deliver every sexual irony and innuendo in the lines. She earned praise as a fine comic actor, but in the character of Hallie, she had found the mold for her own offstage image. She began to step up her own natural exhibitionism, adding material from her stage roles to build a repertory of outrageous stunts and jokes. She could, she discovered, create a gratifying stir by launching into a string of cartwheels down a sidewalk or in the middle of a crowded room, displaying a flash of silk knicker or occasionally her naked bottom. She began to introduce herself at parties with the line, "I'm a lesbian, what do you do?" Tallulah found herself hailed as one of the wits of Manhattan. "I'm as pure as the driven slush," she would remark, and in a coarser version of the famous Oscar Wilde line, she said, "I don't give a fuck what people say about me, so long as they say something." By 1922, she had acquired a large and fanatical group of admirers. Her new fans were mostly girls of her own age. She was moved by the little tributes they brought, posies of flowers or chocolates, and by the constancy of their devotion. One young woman, too poor to afford an adequate winter wardrobe, left with Tallulah's own coat around her shoulders. Her father still wrote regularly and would occasionally visit. Around this time, she embarked on her first serious love affair with a very damaged and dangerous man, George Napier. She was impressed that Naps was an actual aristocrat, the third Baron Allington. His tastes ran to men and women equally, and during the short time he'd been in New York, he'd acquired a scandalous reputation, turning up at the opera with 2 drunken soldiers in tow, and seducing a footman at the home of Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt where he was staying. At their first meeting, she resisted his efforts to seduce her, but within a short while she was deeply in love and believed the careless offer he made to marry her was a genuine promise. In bed, she found Naps alarming. There was a streak of cruelty in his lovemaking. Naps liked to draw a little blood in bed, to bruise and be bruised in return. Sometimes he would be gentle, sometimes malicious. He would disappear for weeks at a time, then turn up out of nowhere. She found him mysterious and enigmatic. When he abruptly told her he had decided to return to England, she was crestfallen. But that autumn, she had been introduced to the British producer and impresario Charles Cochrane, and he offered her to come to London to perform in a play written by the actor Gerald du Maurier. She was sure the stars were in alignment when an astrologer she visited told her that to achieve fame, she would have to cross the ocean. She decided to make a fresh start in London. However, she had no money for the trip. After spending an evening with an old political friend of her grandfather's, she somehow managed to persuade him to pay for the trip, and on the evening of January 23rd, she departed for London with a crowd of tearful fans in their best flapper frocks, waving goodbye. She was 21 and had never left America before. "I thought I was going to Mars," she later said. When she arrived, the play in which she'd hoped to star was already in rehearsal with someone else in the lead role. She persuaded Cochrane to take her to the theater to be introduced to the director the following day. When she arrived, she ran into the actor's dressing room. "Well, here I am," she said. Du Maurier insisted he could do nothing to alter the play's casting. Cochrane, however, was now warming to her cause. He offered to arrange a second meeting, advising her that the director had a weakness for glamorous women. The following night, Tallulah came in her one good evening dress, her hair falling in a barely restrained tumble down her back. His daughter Daphne said, "Daddy, that's the most beautiful girl I ever saw in my life." And with that, she got the role. She was triumphant. But the play was to open in a month. She was under immense pressure, and many of the cast resented this American simply coming in and taking the lead role. When she asked during rehearsal where the toilets were, she was greeted by a frigid silence, punctuated only by a few nervous titters. The cast was horrified, recalled Una Venning. Toilets were something that was never said among men. On the play's opening night, she wept through the first interval, convinced she was a failure. But the reviews were almost unanimous in approving the sincerity and tenderness of her acting. Du Maurier continued to congratulate himself on casting her in The Dancers. Her name sounded exotic to the British public, and much like in New York, droves of young women came to watch her from the cheap gallery seats, seeing her as a kind of flapper heroine. A few weeks after the play opened, she decided to get her hair fashionably shingled. Her fans began to cut their own hair during her performances and throw their shorn tresses down onto the stage as she took her curtain call. But she had not only come to London to find theatrical acclaim, she had come to track down her beloved Naps. When he finally agreed to meet her at the Ritz, he brought her a dog as a peace offering, and she ran into his arms. He made no apologies for having deserted her, or that she would now have to share him with his new boyfriend, Edward Lathan. She was too happy to mind, and it was frequently on the arms of both men that she went out to dine at the Ivy and the Eiffel Tower, and began attending the competitively extravagant costume balls that were so much in vogue among the city's young and rich. As in New York, he regularly disappeared for long periods. She had no notion of how many other lovers he might have. Loving him was part ecstasy, part torture. He was a riddle I couldn't solve, which made him all the more attractive, all the more desirable, she said. She became close with Viola Tree and Audrey Carton, but her most important new acquaintance was Olga Lynn. The most divine woman, Tallulah enthused. Seemingly ageless beneath her powder and rouge, and more or less good-hearted under her social ambition, Olga took a maternal interest in Tallulah's welfare, and that summer invited Tallulah to stay with her. This move was a great relief. Actors in the British theatre were not highly paid. Tallulah's own weekly wage was just £30, and already she had run up large debts, her habitual extravagance exacerbated by her failure to grasp the pound-dollar exchange rate. To Olga, she became something of a pet project. She was put on a diet and taken shopping to help design her wardrobe. Through Olga, she became friends with several of the elite of society and attended several of Maud Cunard's gatherings, became friends with Lady Diana Manners and Duff Cooper and the Churchill family. "Not bad for a you-all miss from Jasper, Alabama," she wrote. Another friend was Max Beaverbrook. The newspaper magnate had been quick to observe that she would be an interesting face for his readers. Beaverbrook invited her to parties, introducing her to everyone from the playboy Aga Khan to politicians like Lord Balfour and David Lloyd George. It was one of the proudest moments of her life when she was able to introduce her father to these impressive acquaintances when he sailed over to London for a short visit. However, after the Dancers closed, she struggled through a few unsuccessful plays. In one of them, she was accompanied by a live pet monkey, so unmanageable that Tallulah had to invent jokes and turn cartwheels to distract the audience while the monkey went to the bathroom on the stage. Tallulah's most successful performance during this period was in the evolution of her offstage persona. She worked hard at it, keeping her repertory of smart one-liners controversially stocked. "What's the matter? Don't you recognize me with my clothes on?" was an oft-repeated line first invented for a possibly uncomprehending Earl, who Tallulah caught staring at her during a dinner at the Savoy. Her terrible driving skills added to her notoriety. She failed to master even the basics of motoring, hiring taxi drivers to guide her to her destinations. Years later, she said, "I was not as free of inhibitions as the casual observer might have believed." On the surface, all confidence, all swagger and strut. Inside, I churned with doubt. Any minute, the clock might strike 12, and I'd be back in a hall bedroom at the Algonquin, or worse yet, in grandfather's yard at Jasper. She was now drinking regularly, as well as dabbling with drugs, having numerous affairs with London's elite. However, still, she firmly believed that one day Naps would marry her. When Diana's mother, the Duchess of Rutland, was asked if Tallulah had ever been engaged to Naps, her reply was crushing. Only she thought so. The first time she felt pregnant was sometime in the mid-1920s, and in a panic, she turned to Olga Lynn, who had a nurse inject her with saline solution. The abortion itself was a painful and dangerous procedure, and she lost so much blood she was bedridden for 2 weeks. Still, that didn't prevent her from going through 3 more procedures by the time she was 30, and from publicizing the fact with a defiant gallows humor. "I'll never go back to that place again," she said after one. "They aborted me with rusty nails and old razor blades." By early 1925, her poor choices of roles was beginning to damage her career. She needed a part with guts and swagger and shock, and set her sights on the play adapted from the Somerset Maugham story, Rain. Its central character, Sadie Thompson, a young prostitute who forms a complex bond with a religious zealot who attempts to reform her, had all the guts she craved. And when Rain was scheduled for a London premiere, she was ready to go to any lengths to secure the role. Yet when Maugham came to watch her, he said she lacked any personality and had her replaced. She felt publicly humiliated. She returned to her London flat, scribbled a goodbye note, and swallowed 20 aspirin. In the morning, she simply awoke with a bad headache. Soon, though, she was given a role in Fallen Angels, as the lead actress fell ill a week before the opening. Tallulah's comic delivery was almost too effective on the opening night. Still feeling the pain of Mom's rebuff, she elicited howls of delight from the audience with her extemporaneous tweaking of the line, "Oh dear Rain," into the knowing, "My God, Rain." But as the decade drew to a close, she decided that it was time to go home. She was approaching 30, Naps was marrying the daughter of an earl, and she was out of money, since she always spent everything she earned. And suddenly, the way was open to her via an extraordinary offer from Paramount, beginning at $5,000 a week. This was the moment when, with the recent coming of sound, Hollywood was signing up every attractive stage star it could find, and the exotic Tallulah, with her husky, seductive voice, could well prove to be the next Garbo, the next Dietrich. "Hollywood for me, I'm afraid," she wrote to her father, and in January 1931, embarked for New York. In a year and a half, Bankhead made 6 feature films and a lot of money, but none of them really worked. It didn't matter whether she was leaping off a balcony rather than go back to her blind husband, escaping from a submarine that her crazed husband had sabotaged, or going on the streets to procure money for the medicine needed by her desperately ill husband. Reviewers said either that she was wasted on such cliched vehicles or that she didn't live up to the better of them. The bottom line is that audiences just didn't take to her. George Cukor, who directed her once, concluded that she wasn't naturally photogenic. On the screen, she had beautiful bones, but her eyes were not eyes for movies. They looked somehow hooded and dead. The reality was that she was first and always a creature of the stage, all about projecting her larger-than-life personality at an audience, never about allowing a camera to explore her face and reveal her feelings. The movies caged and suppressed her. She did, however, have fun in Hollywood, what with her roles, her suntan, and her nonstop parties. Joan Crawford reminisced, "We all adored her. We were fascinated by her, but we were scared to death of her, too. She had such authority, as if she ruled the earth, as if she was the first woman on the moon." There were the usual sexual escapades, including an encounter with Johnny Weissmuller in the Garden of Allah pool, about which she reported that she had been a very satisfied Jane. Yet the biggest scandal she created was a remark she tossed off in an interview. "I haven't had an affair for 6 months. 6 months, too long. I want a man." This was not the kind of publicity the studios condoned, and it helped send her back to Broadway with her earnings of $200,000. For half a dozen years, she failed at everything she tried on the stage, most spectacularly in 1937 when she had the calamitous misjudgment to take on Antony and Cleopatra. She had no classical technique and she refused to be coached. The text was butchered too. In the climactic scene, for instance, the deaths of Cleopatra's handmaidens were eliminated. Because, of course, darling, we only want one death in that scene. One critic wrote that Bankhead barged down the Nile last night as Cleopatra and sank. Also trapped in this disaster was a second-rank actor named John Emery, whom she had picked up on the summer circuit and, rather casually, married. Emery was good-looking, capable, and amiable. Best of all, he bore a marked resemblance to John Barrymore, and not only in profile. Years earlier, when Barrymore revealed himself to her in his dressing room, Tallulah had sworn to herself, and anyone within earshot, never to sleep with any man who wasn't hung like Barrymore, and went on to claim that she had stuck to her word. Since she also claimed 500 or more conquests, perhaps she wasn't always so picky. One of Tallulah's party tricks was to escort guests to the master bedroom, fling back the covers from the bed in which Emery was sleeping, and crow, "Did you ever see a prick as big as that before?" But soon she was telling people, "Well, darling, the weapon may be of admirable proportions, but the shot is indescribably weak." Within a few years, the marriage, such as it was over. During the 30s, she had entered the hospital for what was announced as an abdominal tumor, but was actually a case of gonorrhea. Contracted, she was to say, from George Raft or Gary Cooper. It led to a 5-hour radical hysterectomy, and by the time she left the hospital, she was down to 70 pounds. Undaunted, she announced to her doctor, "Don't think this has taught me a lesson." The hysterectomy left her not only psychologically shaky, but erotically diminished. Again and again, she testified to her lack of physical pleasure, telling Tennessee Williams's friend Sandy Campbell, for instance, that she couldn't reach an orgasm with any man she was in love with. Another aspect of her pathology was her unrestrained exhibitionism. She was famous for throwing off her clothes at parties, for leaving her bathroom door open, for working without panties on. When she was performing in Thornton Wilder's The Skin of Our Teeth, so many people in the audience complained that Actors' Equity had to order her to wear underpants on stage. In the late 30s, after the failure of her vigorous campaign to secure the role of Scarlett in Gone with the Wind, her luck changed. Her commanding performance in Lillian Hellman's The Little Foxes as a malevolent Southern matron who stands by coldly while her husband dies riveted Broadway. A month after the opening, in March 1939, she was on the cover of Life, and the text of the accompanying story was unambiguous. Somehow it seemed impossible to find adequate parts for this strange electric woman with the languid eyes, the panther's step, and the siren's husky voice. But now, she fills for the first time a role carved big and fierce enough for her talent. Yet she lost out to Bette Davis when the play was made into a film. Late in 1942, she opened in the allegorical Skin of Our Teeth, playing the immortal temptress Sabina in the various guises of housemaid, beauty contest winner, and camp follower. This demanding role gave her a chance to display her rollicking humor and her allure, and gave her a second Broadway triumph. And soon she was playing a famous journalist in that claustrophobic wartime drama Lifeboat. It was the most oblique, incongruous bit of casting I could think of, Hitchcock later said. Isn't a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic the last place one would expect Tallulah? But she carried it off and was rewarded by the New York Film Critics Circle, which named her the Best Actress of 1944. There was only one more important film a year later, A Royal Scandal, which sank under the weight of Otto Preminger's direction and her own somewhat labored performance as Catherine the Great. These years that established her as a major force on Broadway also saw the development of her serious interest in politics and world affairs. At the time of Dunkirk, she swore not to have another drink until the Allies were back in Paris, and she more or less kept her word. On the home front, she campaigned for every Democrat in sight and helped her friend Eleanor Roosevelt set up the Washington branch of the Stage Door Canteen. In the early 50s, at the height of Joseph McCarthy's influence, she pulled no punches about her loathing of him. "I think Senator McCarthy of Wisconsin is a disgrace to the nation." She was also a passionate anti-communist. In 1948, she turned up on Broadway in a revival of Noel Coward's Private Lives, which for some time she had been playing occasionally in summer stock, and which she went on playing across the country until 1950. It wasn't Noel Coward's show, but her own outrageous, rampageous eruption of high camp and low comedy. Audiences ate it up. Coward predictably didn't, and it made her a fortune, but it was her last hit in the theater. There were several inconclusive cabaret engagements and countless radio and TV appearances. In 1950, she ushered out commercial radio with a bang as the MC of a weekly hour-and-a-half extravaganza called The Big Show. To everybody's surprise, including her own, it not only was hailed by critics as the potential savior of radio, but was an immediate hit. This was a deserved but short-lived success, as radio inevitably lost out to television. And then in 1952 came her book. Prickly, honest for its day, and amusing, it made a sensation. Who else would have written about her marriage? My interests and enthusiasms are too random for sustained devotion, if you know what I mean. I had roamed the range too long to be haltered. As she passed the age of 50, Tallulah's demons grew stronger. She had always been a heavy drinker. Now she was consuming a quart of bourbon a day, together with a dangerous mixture of Tuinal, Benzedrine, Dexedrine, Dexamyl, and morphine. She had always been an insomniac. Now she was frantic for sleep. As far back as 1948, she had been observed knocking back 5 seconals and a brandy chaser after a night of drinking. She couldn't bear to be alone. Friends, colleagues, servants, and the young men she attached to her, and whom she called her caddies, would be wheedled or ordered to sit on her bed or lie in her bed all night while she struggled for sleep. She couldn't stop talking. Someone followed her around one day and claimed that she had racked up 70,000 words, the length of a novel. Her habit got so bad that she had her maid tape her wrists together to stop her taking pills. One night, a colleague saw her in a hotel hallway, a wild woman, like a caged chimp, he said. Straggle-haired, barely wrapped in a thin robe, she flailed at the walls, sputtering, "Where am I?" There were serious accidents and psychotic episodes. Orson Welles called her the most sensational case of the aging process being unkind. I'll never forget how awful she looked at the end and how beautiful she looked at the beginning. At least her sense of humor didn't desert her. When people on the street asked, "Aren't you Tallulah Bankhead?" she'd answer, "I'm what's left of her, darling." For years, she had said that she wanted to die. Once, playing the truth game with Tennessee Williams, she confessed, "I'm 54 and I wish always, always for death. I've always wanted death. Nothing else do I want more." It was a dozen years later, in 1968, that she finally got her way, quickly succumbing to double pneumonia. Her last words were codeine, bourbon. As the final curtain fell on her storied career, Tallulah Bankhead's legacy shimmered with the echoes of her unforgettable presence. She was a beacon of unapologetic brilliance. Her life, a poignant reminder of the beauty found in imperfection and the courage required to live authentically. Her own words echoing the spirit and life she lived. "If I had to live my life over again, I'd make the same mistakes, only sooner." And so, with the final bow, we remember her not just as a star, but as a blazing constellation. I hope you enjoyed this week's story on Tallulah Bankhead. Please like, share, and subscribe. We need your support to keep the channel going. And as always, thanks for watching.